Our first speaker tonight will be Leigh Schoberth, Senior Preservation Services Manager at Historic New England. In her position, Leigh drives engagement in historic preservation throughout the region through a broad array of preservation-related educational programs, workshops, lectures, and outreach activities. She also connects with private owners through oversight of several preservation easement properties and management of Historic New England's Homeowner Services Program. Previously, Leigh has worked in the private and public sectors of historic preservation, including managing community-oriented preservation initiatives at the Preservation Society of Newport County. She has a BS in art history from the University of Michigan and an MS in historic preservation from Clemson University. Leigh joined Historic New England in 2020. Our second speaker tonight will be Rachel Robinson, Director of Preservation at Providence Preservation Society. Rachel is the daughter of an architect and grew up visiting building sites in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She studied urban planning and preservation at the University of Virginia School of Architecture and later studied historical and sustainable architecture at NYU London in Bedford Square. Rachel began her preservation career working in New Orleans French Quarter and Central City. She's been Director of Preservation at PPS for nearly 4 years. Thank you both for presenting tonight. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Leigh to start her presentation.
Thank you, Dan. Just going to get the presentation pulled up here. All right. Yeah, as Dan said, I'm Leigh Schoberth from Historic New England, and I'm going to be kicking off tonight's lecture with our Boston women architects. So once architecture programs like MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris began admitting women in the 1890s, more women were able to study architecture, open their own firms, hire other women, and receive private commissions. Despite these limitations, by 1920, more than 200 women were practicing architecture in the United States, designing thousands of buildings before they were even allowed to vote. These women were trailblazers in the field, opening doors for future generations of architects. And today we're going to introduce you to a few of them, a few of these pioneering women working out of Boston and Providence. Through these women, we will introduce you to their work, how they influenced architecture through innovative designs in planning, education, and sustainability. So I'm going to start tonight with Lois Lilly Howe and Eleanor Raymond. So one of the challenges for this generation of women architects was professional isolation. Without a network of other women in the field, many individual practitioners struggled to gain respect and recognition by and among their male peers. Lois Lilly Howe, initially discouraged from studying architecture, went on to found Boston's first and one of the country's earliest all-female architecture firms. Howe was born in 1864 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her childhood home, now the site of Harvard Science Center, was across from the high Victorian Gothic building Memorial Hall at Harvard University. When construction began on Memorial Hall in 1870, Howe was just 6 years old, but the experience shaped her future and spurred her fascination with architecture. Howe was accepted into the Harvard Annex, a private program for women taught by Harvard faculty, later known as the Radcliffe College. However, her interest in architecture and design persisted, so instead of attending the Harvard Annex like many of her peers, she chose to pursue a degree in design at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Following the death of her father just 1 year after her graduation in 1887, Howe's mother decided to sell the house near Memorial Hall and build a smaller one on Appleton Street, also in Cambridge. Although a tragedy for the family, this turned to be a serendipitous moment for Howe in two ways. First, she met architect Robert Swain Peabody of the Boston firm Peabody and Stearns, known for their designs of summer cottages like the original Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, which was destroyed by a fire in 1892. Peabody's brother and sister-in-law were the buyers of the Howe's Cambridge house. Peabody was impressed with Howe's suggestion for a modification for a straight stair that Mrs. Frances Peabody, his sister-in-law, wanted remodeled. Howe had proposed a solution even after Robert Peabody declared it impossible. Peabody would later nominate Howe to the American Institute of Architects. In 1901, she became the second woman to be elected after Louise Blanchard Bethune. This and the experience on site of the construction of the Howe's new home on Appleton Street solidified her decision to pursue architecture. In 1887, Howe had petitioned the president of MIT to allow her to complete a partial course in architecture, or a 2-year program. When she entered the program in 1888, she was one of only 2 women in the drafting room of 90. The other woman was Sophia Hayden, who was in the full 4-year program. Hayden and Howe both graduated from their respective programs in 1890, becoming the first women to graduate from the MIT architecture program. For those familiar with the architecture of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, you may recognize Hayden's name. Hayden's design won the national competition for the women's building at the Chicago World's Fair and was constructed, while Howe, who had also submitted design, received second place and a $500 prize. She used the money to partially pay for a grand tour of Europe in 1892 and 1893. Upon her return, Howe had received commissions for renovations and new designs through the family's social connections. Among Howe's first commissions was the Potter's House for a friend and client, Alfred C. Potter. Like many of Howe's early commissions, the Potter House includes separate circulation and rooms to accommodate live-in servants. Later, especially following World War I, we will see designs shift as the client base and program requirements of a house change. By 1900, Howe had enough work to open a firm on Tremont Street in Boston, originally with 2 male partners, but by the end of the year, they had left her high and dry. Howe stated it was one of the best things that ever happened. So undeterred, she pushed forward on her own. Around the turn of the 20th century, efforts to preserve and protect the region's architectural heritage was taking hold. In 1910, Historic New England, then known as the Society for Preservation of New England Antiquities, was founded by William Sumner Appleton. 2 years later, Lois Lilly Howe was among the individuals helping to coordinate raising funds to purchase and preserve the Cooper Frost Austin House in Cambridge, Massachusetts. From the beginning of Howe's architectural career, she placed an emphasis on history and detail. She was involved in renovation projects of historic homes and traveled extensively through New England, documenting buildings and architectural details through photographs and measured drawings. Among her travels, she also visited and photographed another historic New England museum site, Hamilton House in South Berwick, Maine. In partnership with Constance Fuller, an MIT student at the time, some of Howe's drawings from her travels around New England were published in 1913 in Details from Old New England Houses. On the screen here, you can see stair details from Elmwood House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, built circa 1767. And then here we have another detail from Elmwood alongside a photo of the home today. So you can see both the drawing of the entrance detail as well as how it looks on the building itself. Howe eventually took on 2 partners, Eleanor Manning in 1913 and Mary Almay in 1926. While researching women architects in the early 20th century, it's not uncommon to see references to their projects limited to the domestic sphere or residential architecture. Manning's interest in providing good housing design for all clients brought a broader range of residential commissions to the firm. She was involved in organizations for betterment of housing and urban planning and is credited with designing the first public low-income housing in South Boston. Almay, a generalist, brought architectural interior and landscape design to the firm, as well as social connections for potential clients. In the post-World War I era, architects and planners were met with housing shortages, decreasing family size, and fewer live-in servants. Although Howe and Manning continued to receive commissions for more elaborate, large homes, there was a noticeable increase in demand for smaller, affordable homes and housing complex for middle-class families. Many of these designs were published in magazines like McCall, House Beautiful, and Architecture. In 1924, before Almay had joined the firm, Howe and Manning were one of 26 firms hired to build a new 420-acre planned community in Marymount, Ohio, just outside of Cleveland. Marymount was developed as a planned community on the model of the American Garden City design by John Nolan. It included architect-designed affordable homes, a network of parks, streets, and neighborhood amenities like church and recreational facilities. Shown here on the right are two examples of the designs by Howe and Manning. They designed 7 single-family homes and 2 two-family homes as part of the planned community. The firm disbanded in 1937 when Howe retired at the age of 73. During its 40 years, the firm was involved in over 400 commissions, predominantly residential, including Charles Almay Jr. House, designed for Almay's brother. There is so much more to say and to learn about Howe, Manning, and Almay. So this is just an introduction, and I hope I've piqued your interest. So a couple of resources to look for are the History Cambridge site. They're online. They have an online exhibition on Lois Lilly Howe, and I'll provide a few of these links in the chat after my portion. Another is a book by Doris Cole and Karen Cord Taylor, The Lady Architects. This is a great book to kind of learn about the firm and the types of projects that they were working on and some great examples. And also Howe's details from the old New England houses. It includes a number of drawing plates from her travels. And MIT holds the firm's archives. So once access is opened back up, I know I'm hoping to get in there and take a look at what they have. So next we have Eleanor Raymond, another Cambridge native. Her long career spanned over 50 years from 1919 to 1973 with 200 primarily residential commissions. Her designs included historical renovations as well as modern residential designs that embrace new materials and push technological advancements in architecture. Inspired by her landscape course at Wellesley and her travels in Europe following her graduation in 1909, Raymond sought an opportunity to continue her studies in landscape architecture. So she attended a lecture series by landscape architect Fletcher Steele, who she ended up interning for, and later he introduced her to the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture for Women. The Cambridge School began in 1915 as an informal program started by Harvard professors Henry Atherton Frost and Bremer Wyden Pond, for one student who wished to continue her studies in architecture at Harvard when the graduate program did not admit women. The Cambridge School provided women with a unique opportunity to receive an academic training in architecture and landscape architecture in an all-female environment. The school's curriculum focused on the study of residential design and gardens, similar to many programs at the time, but it was not a degree-giving university and did not include large-scale corporate or organizational projects that other programs would have exposed their students to. At the time, it was believed that women architects were more likely to receive private commissions than to be hired by corporations or organizations, so the program focused on the domestic realm. But as Raymond's message to her classmates suggests, that despite the limitations of the study, the Cambridge School created professional opportunities for women that generations before could not have imagined. So Raymond began her career as a draftsperson while she was still a student in the Cambridge program in Henry Frost's office, one of the founders of the Cambridge School and also her professor at the time. But upon her graduation in 1919, Raymond was named Frost's sole partner in the firm. Frost and Raymond's partnership came at the height of the post-World War I housing shortage, and strategically the firm advertised that its commissions included homes, gardens, interiors, and furnishings. So here on the slide, we see the James H. Cleves House in Winchester, Massachusetts, and this is one of Frost and Raymond's early projects. Raymond retained her position with Frost until she opened her own firm in Boston in 1928. Through introduction to several of Raymond's solo projects, we're going to start to see the breadth of her architectural design, her experimentations with building materials, sustainable technologies, but also the supportive role other women played through collaborations and as clients. In 1920, when the Boston city officials decided to widen Charles Street on Beacon Hill, about 10 feet was sliced off the fronts of buildings to accommodate the widening. One of these buildings was Raymond's future residence at 112 Charles Street. Raymond purchased the facadeless townhouse and undertook its renovations and restoration. The building needed to meet its occupants' unique set of needs, providing both home and office space for several businesswomen, including Eleanor, her sister Rachel, Ethel Power, and the twin sisters Mary and Florence Cunningham, as well as an apartment for Eleanor and Rachel's mother and a view of the Charles River Basin. Raymond brought a sensitive preservation approach to her renovation designs that rival today's adaptive reuse standards. In the photo here, we see the facadeless building on the left, and on the right, Raymond's new facade in character with the red brick Georgian facades of the surrounding Beacon neighborhood. On a few projects, we see the collaborative efforts of the Charles Street residents. The photo here is Dorothy Ellis's high spruces in Haddam, Connecticut. Raymond designed the architectural renovations with the help of her sister Rachel on the interior design, as well as Mary Cunningham tackling the landscape and Ethel Power showcasing the project as editor of House Beautiful. Ethel Power had a critical, though inconspicuous, role in promoting and supporting women architects as editor of House Beautiful for over a decade. Through articles, she brought attention to the works of her lifelong companion, Eleanor Raymond, and other graduates of the Cambridge School. In the November 1924 issue of House Beautiful, the Charles Street renovations were highlighted. Powers also published a number of books, including The Small American Home, which included a compilation of 55 designs by notable architects, and included Frost and Raymond's Cleves house design, which we saw earlier. Rachel Raymond worked both as an interior designer on projects with Eleanor, but also was a client. Following Eleanor's trip to Europe and the Bauhaus in 1930, Eleanor was inspired by the European modernism and looking for an opportunity to try her own take. So at the Rachel Raymond House, we see elements of the European modernist style like flat roofs and strong horizontal lines, but Raymond used local New England materials, textures, and color opposed to the stark white of the European examples. In Amelia Peabody, Raymond found a patron of architecture. Between 1933 and 1972, Peabody commissioned Raymond to design over 13 projects. The sculptor and philanthropist provided land and funding for not only Raymond's most innovative designs, but also encouraged her explorations in material and architectural style. A sculpture studio, while a functional space with specific demands, Raymond brought her own style through details like jade green doors and railings and the placement of Peabody's dog sculptures seen in the left photo. You can see one here and then one here on the other side. Raymond wrote, "I believe I must take the owner's desires and make them beautiful." The Peabody Sculpture Studio was constructed of concrete block with stucco exterior and included a large door for material deliveries, waterproof walls that could be hosed down for easy cleanup, and skylight for natural lighting. One of Raymond's material explorations with Amelia Peabody was the plywood house. While plywood was first patented in 1865 in the United States, production of standardized 4x8 sheet as a building material was not until 1928. The exterior of the plywood house was made with these standardized panels in 1940. I was unable to find photographs of Raymond's other material experimentations like the masonite house and the aluminum barn. However, it's interesting to note that the masonite was a relatively new material, invented in just 1925, and Raymond's designed the masonite house just 16 years later. Raymond's best known design is the Dover Sun House. Raymond worked with MIT engineer Dr. Maria Telks to design the experimental house using a new solar technology with the hope to meet 100% of the heat demand. The storage device was not water, but rather phase-changing Glauber salts. That's spelled Glauber, just in case I'm pronouncing it wrong. The idea was when the temperature of the collector plates, shown here in the diagram, and then here on the photo, what looks to be the second floor windows. So when these collector panels reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the fans would circulate the hot air around the tanks of Glauber salts, causing the salt to melt. Unfortunately, the fans used a lot of power and the salts did not change phases, and the experiment was ended in 1953. Some resources declare that the Dover Sun House was the first solar powered house, while other sources debunk this. I think what may be unique with this house compared to other solar houses at the time was that it had multiple rooms and not just one large one, as well as an actual family was living in it during the time of the experiment. From when Raymond first opened her office in 1928 through the 1970s, she designed and executed over 200 projects. Her designs range from utilitarian structures like a piggery to the technologically innovative Sun House. Unfortunately, several of Raymond's designs have been lost to demolition, including the Rachel Raymond House and the Sun House. Nevertheless, her contributions are significant, and those that remain enrich and enliven the social and architectural history of the region. So I'll finish here with a few resources to learn more about Eleanor Raymond and her works. So there's the biography by Doris Cole of Eleanor Raymond. It's available on Amazon, maybe available at other stores. With some of these, the publication dates are 1980 and 1990, so availability may be limited. Another great online resource to learn more about Eleanor Raymond, as well as Lois Lilly Howe and other American women architects, is the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation. They have a great online resource that gives you an introduction to about 50 pioneering women working in architecture. And finally, the Eleanor Raymond collection is held at Harvard University, except for a photographic collection that Historic New England holds. I just thank you, everyone, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will turn this over to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Leigh. Let me share my screen. All right, thank you, Leigh and Dan and everyone at Historic New England for inviting me to be here tonight. It's exciting to share these women who may be new to you. Mine, of course, come from Providence, where I live and work. And so we'll take a look at Frances Henley and Margaret Geddes. And here we go. Oops. All right, so here's our introduction to Frances Evelyn Henley. She was the first woman to graduate in the complete course of architecture at RISD. She finished in 1897 with honors. Apparently 2 other women started with her, but when the class came for perspective, they decided to transfer over to the art department. So Frances had the interest and aptitude in math and art to complete her degree. and is the first woman to practice under her own name and independently in Rhode Island, and some sources say even New England. She was certainly among the first, if not the very first. So we're quite proud of Frances. There are many great quotes from her in newspapers and other sources. I wanted to share this one because I think it's quite telling of what she faced at the turn of the last century. The time arrived for me to join the class in architecture. I was more or less of a puzzle for the professor, who began by teaching me the decorative part, while the boys were beginning with the constructural. And when I requested that I be given the complete course, he said, "Oh, I thought you would want the pretty part only." Such was the attitude of man toward woman when I began my study of architecture, as well as when I began to practice. So that's what Frances was facing, but she persisted and began her career in downtown Providence, working with these two men, Franklin Sawtelle and Arthur Almy. Apparently, the Wilcox Building, which still stands on Weybosset Street in downtown Providence, was a hive of design activity. It is said that after Almy's death in 1924, she inherited his business with the condition that she would remain unmarried. I feel that that was a misguided discrimination, because Frances was a lesbian and could not have married her partner if she had wanted to. But nonetheless, she began her career. Please note that Franklin Sawtelle died in 1911. And now we have a building commonly attributed to Frances, although credit in 1976 in the amended College Hill National Register District nomination gives the credit to Franklin. He undoubtedly received the commission for this first purpose-built educational building and residential at the Wheeler School in Providence, but Wheeler credits Frances with finishing the work and most of the design. It should be noted too that Wheeler School was founded by a woman, Mary C. Wheeler. And I was very fortunate in connecting with Wheeler's de facto archivist on the eve of her retirement. And she was generous in sharing some of these plans. These are two I've put together just to show you some of Frances's work. She stayed with Wheeler for about 25 years doing other projects and additions. So here you see two, both working at the Providence campus and the Seekonk campus. All right, so if you do a search for Frances or begin your own research of her, you will likely come upon this beautifully colored drawing, rendering like I did, but I was unable to identify a specific address for this house to find out if it was built and if it survives. I have highlighted or enlarged Frances's own signature there at the bottom, but a beautiful home and simply says West Shore of the Narragansett Bay. But at least I had the foresight to reach out to a very friendly and helpful librarian at Rhode Island College, Amy Barlow, separately to see if she could help me navigate and look through some of the Providence Journal Index to find information on Frances or Margaret. And she responded back, yes. And I know that there's information about Frances because my mother grew up in a house she designed. Amy then sent a picture of the same image to me. And I thought, you know, even for Rhode Island, this is a little bit of a coincidence. So Amy was able to confirm the address. The house was built. It was known as Kinstanholm. The original builders were Edwin Kent and his wife, Emma Stanley. So they worked with Frances in 1910 to design this house. And there was a wonderful Sunday afternoon spread in 1911 on the house. We see Frances in the bottom left there in her Titanic era finery, all dressed up. And then two pictures of the house. The top middle one I know is grainy, but we can just make out the painted custom wicker furniture, the ingle nook, the fireplace, and how it was decorated when the house was first built. And the author goes to great pains to show that this was a house designed by a female architect for a female client, even though the man paid for it, to satisfy the feminine demand for closets and dustless devices in a unique bungalow. And as the mistress and maid of my own house, I do share the same desire for dustless devices, but I don't seem to have very many of them. But the article is great. It goes basically room by room, going through all the conveniences of the day to make life easier for the mistress and maid of the house. And it survives. This is a historical photo that Amy kindly provided from her family archive, but we can see the house as built. And some more personal family photos that she shared with me, showing the porch, and then inside a beautiful family bride. But my eye goes straight to the inglenook, the built-in bookcases, and the fireplace with Roman brick. So that's very narrow yellow brick that Frances specifically picked out for her client. All right, if it weren't for a newspaper article in 1932, we might have not attributed this building, which was built and still stands on the east side of Providence, to Frances. But here's another example of her work. And the author was impressed that she was able to fit a very large house thoughtfully on a small corner lot. This house does survive, as I said. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it's lost many character-defining features, including the front porch with the little benches built in as the balustrade, and this useful, economical, what am I trying to say? Side porch to give privacy and use of this space, again, on a very small lot. The pergola, that word left me for a moment. And here we have Frances's own house. So she built this for a client, Mr. Allen, and then he or his estate sold it to her in 1930. So she moved in. This is down in the Patuxent Neck, part of Patuxent Village in Cranston, made some alterations in 1930, including the addition of what is described as a rose window in the living room. Now, one of the great things about the internet is that if a house has been on sale in the last, let's say, 10 years, we can probably find pictures and maybe even video online hosted by the realtor. So you can go through, it's very convenient for an architectural historian, or if you're just someone who likes to snoop in houses, this is a legal way to do it. And I was able to go in to the house and find this image of the window that Frances inserted for herself. All right, so Frances passed away in 1955. Her obituary was picked up by the AP, so it got good coverage, giving her credit as being a first woman in architecture. I think she probably had something to do with the language that was used or gathered for these descriptions, including Miss Henley had claimed that male architects formed an association shortly after her graduation in an attempt to keep her out of the profession. So maybe her male colleagues knew that she was clever and determined and thought she might be a threat to their own practices. I don't know. This other one says that when, a quote, direct quote from Frances, "When I first went into the business, there seemed to be an unwillingness on the part of some of the public to call me an architect. Even the directory man," and that would be the city directories, the precursor to the Yellow Pages, "wanted to put me down as an architectress." So I wonder if some of her other very few colleagues, women colleagues of the time, also had to deal with the label architectress. And another book, I don't believe Leigh mentioned this one, but maybe she did, The First American Women Architects, has this brief description of Frances. So she's included in that. And again, there are resources out there, and the scholarship is being done to recognize these important early women architects. So now we'll switch gears to Margaret Kelly Geddes, an architect and planner, community activist here in Rhode Island and in Providence. She was born in Evanston, Illinois, and when her widowed mother remarried, the family relocated to Providence, where she attended the Wheeler School and then went on to Vassar and the School of Architecture at MIT. Her master's thesis was a beach development for an unbuilt project down in Narragansett. And during World War II, she did her bit as a project planner for the Federal Public Housing Authority down in DC. I also read that she drove a Army Jeep. She ran into Peter at some point. He was an architecture graduate from Columbia. They married during the war in 1942 and had a practice together between 1934 and 1948, doing primarily, as we shall see, residential architecture in Southern New England. I'm a firm believer that women should not be defined by the men in their lives. However, it is notable that Margaret Kelly Geddes' maternal grandfather is Daniel Burnham. So if you notice Burnham as her middle name at birth, you might have picked up on this connection. I read that the Burnham family reunions often resembled AIA connections because there were many architects and planners in the family, including Margaret's brother, Burnham Kelly, who was for many years the dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and City Planning at Cornell. But again, back to Margaret, and in this case with Peter. They had offices in these two notable buildings in downtown Providence. On the left, we have the Rhode Island Hospital Trust Company building, which is today an incredible adaptive reuse project with the RISD Library on the first floor and student housing above. And then on the right, I hope this is familiar to you, the Industrial Trust Building, commonly and lovingly known today as the Superman Building. If you know anything about me or PPS, you know this building is the apple of our eye and the focus of our attention because it has been vacant for 8 years. The arrows, I will say, are approximate just to show you what floor they were on in these two buildings. All right, if you want to learn more about any architect who practiced in the middle of the 20th century, there's a great online resource posted by the American Institute of Architects. So this entry comes from 1956, and it details in shorthand all of Margaret's accomplishments and associations. We can see her firms. She practiced under her own name, and then with Peter as Gettys and Kelly. And later, Peter would go on to form a firm with Albert Harkness of Providence. So Harkness and Gettys and Margaret sometimes worked with them. She also was an important person at the Providence Redevelopment Agency. And so she went on, urban planning, city planning was also a very important passion of hers. She was involved with the League of Women Voters. She served as secretary of the American Institute of Architects, Rhode Island chapter. So she was a busy lady. Peter, I don't know if he couldn't be bothered. He certainly had his own accomplishments, but maybe he forgot to send in his submission. Margaret grew up in this house, again, when her family relocated to Providence, 164 Brown Street. So she was living here, according to Wheeler and their alumna directory of 1939. She was still here prior to being married. So she would do a lot of work very nearby. But first, we're going to take a quick trip to Massachusetts to see some work that they did featured in national periodicals. So this is a guest house, which I think is adorable, up in Sturbridge, Mass. This house and the next one, I was unable to confirm if they still exist. We've got a lot of people in the audience. If you know, please share in the chat. But this one was featured in a magazine with an article on 81 new houses, which was really going over. Think about, this is 1941, this is the beginning of World War II, and architecture is really changing, especially in the academy, between the classical education into this modernism coming from Europe, as Leigh said. And so there's also this hybrid of local vernacular, traditional, especially with materials, and more modern shapes and designs. And so I think that's where we find Margaret and Peter's work. So it was featured in this magazine. I don't believe these drawings are by Peter or Margaret because the drawings are pretty standardized among all 81 houses. And so I think it was probably done by the magazine. And here's another one, arguably the largest private residence that they worked on, the Rowland House in Brookfield, Mass. This is the charming flower room. This house dates from 1938 and was also featured in a periodical. And here we see the flower room in plan with its curvilinear accompanying terrace. But you can see it's quite a big house, and I hope it's still standing, and I would love to go visit. If you can help in that effort, let me know. Okay, back to Providence. And here's Margaret and Peter's own house that they designed for Manning Street. We can see just in the background two very typical Providence houses. Providence at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century went crazy with Queen Anne and colonial revival and mashing them up, and these big, almost over the top but not quite houses. And so that was the landscape when Margaret and Peter inserted this modern house, pretty demure, in brick, stripped of all the fanciness and fussiness. But I do love how there are modillions at the cornice there. I think that's a nice reference to all of the colonial period and colonial revival architecture that surrounded them. Note too at the bottom here, the John Hutchins Cady collection, available online to search through the Providence Public Library. John was a architect himself in Providence, but more importantly, in my opinion, he was an architectural historian and prolific scrapbooker. So I use his images all the time. I have to take a deep breath here because Peter and Margaret left their house to Brown University. It is what is now on the Brown campus. And 6 years ago, before I moved to Providence, let the record show, Brown demolished this house. And if you can make out the white letters there in the top right image, you'll see that ironically, this was the Urban Studies Department. And so this house and its neighbors were cleared for a new science building. But the closest we can come to touring the house today is this road tour. I encourage any of you to search road tour and a topic that you're interested in, well-known stories and people and places from Rhode Island and some lesser known. And so their house is one of these featured. Okay, but if we do just walk across Hope Street, we can find two houses. I will go ahead and tell you these both exist today. I saw them last week in person, that Margaret and Peter designed for clients. This one is 47 Manning Street. It stands today. And I think it is notable that it has a PPS historic marker. So if you've come to Providence and you've seen the white markers with a name and a date, that's one of our oldest programs that PPS administers. It's been around for 50 years. But for this to be a modern house, of course, it has age on it. It is not. It is older than 50 years, but it's one of our younger buildings within the marker database. And the newest historic marker in Providence belongs to its sister building just next door facing Hope Street. This one was just approved for a marker this spring. And this house is owned by a dear friend and PPS trustee. These images were taken again from a real estate listing prior to her moving in. But what was miraculous is that Wendy was able to find original documents and plans for the house. People ask me all the time, how can I find drawings for my house? And I have to be Debbie Downer a little bit because it's very much a needle in the haystack. There are architectural archives. Rhode Island Historical Society, for example, holds some drawings, but it's very hard. Sometimes you can track down a firm that may have dissolved but been absorbed by another firm that exists today. The best thing you can do and hope for is to take a look in your attic or your basement or the closets or a safe even, that's happened. And you might find documents, which I think should go down and stay with the house so that, once the current steward moves out, these documents still exist. So we have very specific specifications for 177 Hope Street. And I have enlarged Peter and Margaret's stamp there. And you can see how they signed the drawings. there in the bottom left. And so they have the 211 Hospital Trust Building address. And Margaret passed away in 1995. She has this lovely obituary that marks some of her many accomplishments and associations. What I hadn't mentioned before was that she was a lifelong member of the Providence Art Club. But here we have, the end of her life. We just lost her in 1995. And that wraps up Margaret and Frances. But I do want to leave you with one other important woman who I happen to know. Martha Warenfels was just elected to as a fellow of the American Institute of Architects earlier this fall. She was not the first, but she was the first woman. It's about time. She's a lovely person and a dear friend of PPS. And the cherry on top is that she's a preservation architect, and this is one of her favorite projects. So that concludes, I think. Thank you to all of you for listening, and to Amy and Laurie and these other institutions for helping me out in my research. And now we would be happy to hear your comments and to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Leigh and Rachel. I know that everyone is giving standing ovations, although they're muted and we can't hear them. What wonderful presentations and really important work to highlight and remember tonight. So looking forward to hearing some questions. We have a few comments and questions already in the Q&A. And for those of you that didn't hear me earlier, you came on maybe during my introduction. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers, you can try to add them to the Q&A button, which is on the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer those for you. And then also, both Rachel and Leigh, we're going to give you their email addresses, so we could always follow up with your questions there. So Sue Johnson actually wrote in as a volunteer at Historic New England Archives. I cataloged the Raymond Frost photograph collection held in the library and archives. It was a lovely project and very interesting to learn about the successful early architect. Then there was a question from Betsy Bray, are the plywood and Sun House still standing? And Leigh, I think you may have mentioned that we're missing at least one of those.
I know for sure that the Sun House has been demolished. My assumption is the plywood. What's been kind of tricky with a lot of Eleanor Raymond's work is the Sun House was kind of with the sustainable and the, that kind of design. And it seems to be kind of the one that a lot of people talk about. So that when you are trying to search through her work, that one comes up the most often. I have not been able to confirm kind of some of the other 13 buildings that she had done with Amelia Peabody and where those are at, but I do know the Sun House and Raymond House are both demolished, and I believe the Plywood House and the studio are also all gone. So it's been a really, and a few of them have been very recent, so it's quite the loss that we've preservation did not succeed in that front. So
sure. So it's the Amelia Peabody Sculpture Studio. There's a question about that's one.
I believe that one has also been demolished. I only found one reference that said it was. But I believe that one is also gone.
We have a question. How does one become a preservation architect? A degree in historic preservation and an architectural license? Who wants to take that one?
Oh,
Rachel, you're just muted. Yep.
Great question. I think Leigh started her studies in architecture. I did not. I know I think it's just taking a personal interest and being in a school where there might be a preservation certificate program. I think Tulane down in New Orleans specializes in preservation architecture, but it's important. I mean, most of us live in older buildings that exist, not a blank slate new building that we dream about. So it's important that we have these, geriatric specialists for our older buildings. But Leigh, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a combination of, depending on how the architecture degree is definitely part of there. I know there are programs that have kind of a preservation certificate as well. Sometimes it's, preservation or architecture undergrad combination with maybe a master's in historic preservation. And it can be also just knowing that architects have to go through an internship period that, depending on if you're working in a firm that is kind of preservation oriented, you might kind of, your career might go in that direction. with the types of projects that come into the firm. So I think it's kind of a combination of education and kind of that experience that you're getting in the field.
Great. Someone had asked, you know, when MIT took women architects into their full program?
I know, so Sophia Hayden was the first one to graduate from MIT's program. And so she would have started in 1886. So I believe that, I don't know if there was other women that were in the program that maybe didn't complete it prior to her. One of the things that I've heard with MIT, because it was a land grant university, I think is the right term for it, that they were kind of, were early on almost kind of forced to do the co-education, whether, you know, they allowed women or kind of women finished the program or were discouraged from it. I couldn't say. I think the architecture program began kind of in the 1870s, and they were technically co-educational from the start because of that land grant. But Sophia Hayden in 1890 was the first one to graduate, so she would have started that program 4 years earlier.
And then I can add, with Margaret being the baby of our bunch, she graduated in 1933, and she was one of 3 women in the program. And so if you're interested in finding more of these early women, especially at MIT, I know that their library and museum are quite helpful. I was able to track down her thesis, but of course, right now we have limited access to go in person.
Did either of the architects leave any letters or documents about reactions by contractors to working with women architects?
I saw that, Jim Barnes, and I meant to mention Jim earlier. While I was on vacation just last week, Jim alerted me that someone else I know that is a friend of PPS also grew up in the house, Lauren, who's in the audience tonight, who happens to be Amy's godfather and uncle. So I fully expect that many of you in the audience also grew up in one of the houses that Leigh and I have shared with you. And if you do have any pictures or stories, we would love to hear them. But in terms of, you know, most of the articles I found were promotional, focusing on Frances's in particular work. I do know that it was specified that, or pointed out that she not only would do the drawings and designs for her clients, but stick through the work herself as through the build and get up in the rafters. And like I said, she picked out the bricks. So I think she was very hands-on. I don't know how the contractors reacted to her. We certainly have evidence about how some of her early peers reacted to her.
Yeah, I think kind of there may be, without access to kind of the archives and collections with Lois Lilly Howe and Eleanor Raymond, I haven't been able to see kind of what sorts of resources they have in there. So what I've been able to pull is kind of online resources and kind of articles where people have quoted or pulled quotes. So specifically reactions to contractors, I'm not sure, but I am hoping to kind of dig into those files and see if we can find some more of that kind of their voice coming through in those, but I couldn't say for sure at this point.
Nice. We have a question about, does PPS ever arrange house tours? If so, how do people find out about them?
We do. And usually our annual Festival of Historic Houses would take place in a week. Because we're coming out of the pandemic, we decided early on this year to instead do a garden tour, so people can still visit historic sites and gardens throughout the city. So it takes place in not this weekend, but next, I believe. Please check our website, ppsri.org. And we'd love to see you if you want to come down to Providence for the day. So not going inside this year, but there'll be plenty of information on the gardens and the houses. And Jim Barnes, who is a architecture professor at RISD and has been for many years, will be one of the speakers in an event leading up to the garden tour.
That's great. We have a comment about, or why is it so difficult to find the addresses of these houses? Don't the plans have to be registered? This must be very hard to locate. Yeah.
Yeah, I reached out to city archives here in Providence, particularly to see if I could find anything on Margaret, since we don't have a photo of her. Leigh and I both looked. We could not find one. But because she had worked at the redevelopment agency for the city for so many years, municipalities don't always keep every piece of paper, so we can go through records. Our marker library online is a great source of information, but is more of a chain of title history than architectural history. But it is hard. Another great source is National Register nominations for historic districts. That's when you can find a little snippet, usually of every building within the area that might give you a name of the architect or builder. But it wasn't always, sometimes we've just lost that information. I did want to say before I forget that there is a line from Margaret to the work that we're doing today. When she was at the city of Providence, she worked to develop the first local historic district in Providence, which was College Hill. No surprise, that was established in 1960. And 61 years later, we are still working to expand the College Hill Local Historic District for the second time. We crossed a big hurdle this past week. And so once that's approved by the city council, the two Peter and Margaret buildings that survive on the east side of Hope Street will now have the protection of a local historic district. So in some small way, I'm continuing her work.
That's wonderful. Just learned that my cousin who lived at 66 Seaview Ave, probably right next door to 72 Seaview in Patuxent Village, beautiful area. That's great. I live in a typical late 19th century house on the west side of Providence. There are many houses like mine on my street and in the neighborhood where architects and or builders using common plans or blueprints. And if so, where might I find examples of these types of plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think unless someone has made the effort to do a book on typical house styles and, vernacular architecture in a place and each place and even particular neighborhoods, that's sometimes hard to track down. Think of large colonial, post-colonial land ownership, and then that being subdivided and subdivided. And so you do get these plats where certainly there were buildings done on spec by an architect or a builder. And so certainly we see lots of sister buildings. I'm also in the west end of Providence here. So lots of sister buildings, you see this all over. And so if you can track down maybe the source of who started that trend, or also looking at pattern books, because we have architecture specific to places, but we also have styles and types that were found all over the United States.
That's great. Someone wrote, thought this might be helpful. A great book on the data and women in architectural programs is in Doris Cole's From Tippy to Skyscraper, History of Women in Architecture, which is great.
Yeah, I came across that one, but because it's I think from the 1970s, it seems to be in very limited, mostly in kind of archives, which I wasn't able to access. Seemed to be everybody who held that. So I haven't been able to look at the book, but it's definitely another one from Doris Cole. She was working on Eleanor Raymond, and she also was working on Lois Lilly Howe. So she was doing a lot of great research, and it seems to be kind of the primary books on both of these women. So yeah, that's another great book from her. It's, and I'm hoping to get my hands on a copy soon.